Well, it's a great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Professor Emeritus John Kutzbach. John has had a distinguished, at least 60-year affiliation with our department, earning his master's degree with Heinz Letow, doing the famous bushel basket experiments on Lake Mendota. And then he earned his PhD with Reed Bryson in 1966, during which he had the distinction of being the first scientist in our field to use principal component analysis in a published paper. And that's been referenced now, Dan said, over 700 times, right? But not nearly as many as it should have. It seems like it's been serially referenced in bibliographies, but not directly. And he, as we all know, he was not the last to use PCA in studying the atmosphere. But immediately after earning his PhD, he joined our faculty in 1966. He served as director of CCR for 34 years, starting in 1970. He's a senior scientist there still, and he was granted emeritus status in our department in 2002. And John is among the most decorated scientists on our campus. He's a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the American Geophysical Union, and the American Meteorological Society. He's a recipient of the Humboldt Medal of Germany in 1978, the Milankovitch Medal of the European Geophysical Union in 2001, the Lifetime Career Medal of the American Quaternary Association in 2004, and the Chinese Academy of Sciences Medal in 2017. And in the midst of all of that, 2006 was a particularly happy year for John, as he was not only awarded the Roger Revelle Medal of the AGU, but he was also elected a member of the National Academy of Sciences in that year. One of only 3 such members, I think, in the environmental sciences and geophysics on our astonishingly accomplished campus. And lest those of you who don't know John personally might assume that such a record of accomplishments is reserved only for a person of little humor, few outside interests, or an indifference to fellowship, I can assure you that this is not the case, as it has been my great pleasure to have enjoyed a really warm friendship with John over the last 25 years. Amazing. Isn't that amazing? And as he will demonstrate this afternoon, John just keeps on thinking about nature. He doesn't quit. He continues to pursue intriguing and challenging research questions, and he will tell us today about his recent thinking regarding the underlying forcing of the climatic conditions that characterized the prehistoric a period of hominid migration across and out of Africa some 100,000 or more years ago. So please join me in welcoming our esteemed colleague, Professor John Kutzbach, to our
John, thank you for that more than kind introduction, and thank you, all of you, for coming. I became an emeritus professor in 2002, and although I have remained affiliated with the Center for Climate Research, I tend to come to the department, I come for some colloquia. I tend to come after business hours when I can park nearby and roam the halls. So I'm actually around. It's just that I'm invisible to most of you. But it's a pleasure to see so many old friends and some people I don't know well. But it's great to be back here and to share what is a John Martin really alluded to it already. It's actually almost a 60-year story that I'm going to tell you about, and I just feel very honored that I'm able to tell a story that had its roots 60 years ago, and still be hopefully at the top of this narrow. What I found I've had to do over the years is narrow the number of things I stay interested in, because I can't keep up with nearly everything. I should have mentioned my colleagues. I hope you saw their names at the bottom. They were up there for a long time. But I see this is going to, okay. This is where the story started. Well, since I know how to make this thing go backwards, let me go back. Juan helped with the simulation. Feng He, who is here, is doing the analysis right now. Andy Cohen is a paleo ecologist and anthropologist at the University of Arizona. Ian Orland is a research scientist at Geosciences next door, and Guangshan Chen actually did the first part of the simulation many years ago. As John mentioned, I did my master's degree here in 1960 or 61. At that time, people had to, I hope this thing settles down.
Use the keyboard here. Got it.
Up should go back.
Yeah, I want the picture.
Up was not behaving earlier.
Second one, okay. I'll try not to go backwards
I'll just stay
anymore.
up here.
Okay. I had done the bushel basket experiments. It did it again. It just moved.
Let's abandon it and I'll move them for you.
I didn't touch anything. I had done the bushel basket experiments for my master's degree. I was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the Air Force, and I was a Air Force weather forecaster in Châteauroux, France. Turns out that Châteauroux is close to the southwestern part of France, where early humans lived 50, 40,000 years ago, in the Dordogne Valley, a protected and sheltered area away from the ice sheets. And they painted these wonderful, wonderful pictures. There's a place called Lascaux, which is called the Sistine Chapel of Paleolithic art. And I was privileged to go there when it was still open and to actually visit 12 or 15 caves of prehistoric art, some of which I crawled back on the hands and knees with miner's candles to look at. And this is me. This is the early hominid here. Probably an image that would not be used anymore. But so this goes back almost 60 years. And the reason I'm mentioning this is because I really had focused on things like micrometeorology and, as John mentioned, principal component analysis. And I hadn't thought much about past climates. And so it was this visit to Lascaux in 1961 that really got me thinking about why are there ice ages, what caused humans to leave Africa, because that was already known at that time, and when did they leave, and things of that nature. And those questions are still not answered, but they've been bumping around in my head ever since, and I've been lucky enough to have a chance to work on it. Next, please. So where part of the field is right now is that people know that early modern humans had their origin in the East African Rift Valley somewhere around 200,000 years ago. There were primates, 1 million, 2 million. Lucy, I think, is 2.8 or 2 million years old. But the people that we call Homo sapiens really are first seen around 200,000 years ago. And early on, people began to find sites of these early modern humans moving up through the Arabian desert and the Sahara into the Levant, modern day Israel, and so on. Still not too many sites, but they found evidence that these people lived in more humid environments. So the idea evolved that maybe there were times when the Sahara and the Arabian deserts were not as arid as they are today. And I began to notice that a lot of the dates of early occupation seemed to cluster around particular times that I began to know something about, like 125,000 years ago. And then there were also a lot of early occupation sites during the glacial period. So the climate question that began to be interesting was, were there times when the Sahara and the Arabian Middle Eastern deserts were less arid than they are today? Next. And this is I think, a National Geographic slide giving a somewhat larger picture. It's not too accurate here. The East African Rift Valley is more here than here, so here's where early humans started, but they were certainly up in Arabia by 50, 70,000 years ago, beginning of the Ice Age. And then almost in a wink of an eye, they were here. This is where I first encountered the Paleolithic art at Lascaux in 1961, dating from around 45,000 years ago. But they also were making it to Australia and to the east coast of Asia very quickly. So it's an interesting story, and I'm just going to be concerned with this part of the story today. Next. And I personally got involved in this around 1980, when I began to realize that the Earth's orbital changes affected monsoons. And that was a new idea at the time. People were thinking that Earth's orbit affected the onset of glaciations, but there was no connection between Earth's orbit and the monsoons. So in a minute I'll show you the orbital part of it, but at times when the Earth is closest to the sun in northern hemisphere summer, so when perihelion is in summertime, the continent of Eurasia warms up, and we showed this in a very early climate model experiment in 1981. This changes the ocean to land temperature gradient. It lowers the pressure over the continent, and it increases the inflow of moist air from the oceans toward the land. And the small stippling here is a hint of where precipitation was increased at those times. This particular simulation for 9,000 years ago is about the last time that the Sahara was considerably wetter than it is today. Now we're at, the precession cycle is 20,000 years in length, so now we're in a particularly arid phase of the Sahara. Next peak. So here's the astronomical review. This cartoon here, the sun and the Earth, shows the Earth being tilted relative to the plane of the ecliptic, moving around the sun. Right now, perihelion is in northern hemisphere. The pole is tilted away from the sun. Northern hemisphere winter. So actually our winters are not quite as cold as they might be. Hard for anybody to believe given this year. And the summers are a little on the cold side. But if you turn the clock back to 10 or 11,000 years ago, the precession of the rotational axis had gone through a half cycle, such that when the axis is pointed, the North Pole is pointed more towards the sun, it's northern hemisphere summer. So at that time we have warmer summers and colder winters. And this is the situation that I showed on the last slide. I call this high seasonality. That's what the H is for. P is due to the precession cycle. And it's high seasonality because the summers are warm and the winters are cold. Whereas now, in a relative sense, it's lower seasonality because the winters are a little bit warmer and the summers are a little bit colder. we can look at this in a time perspective here, starting at the present, going back 150,000 years. And this is the summer radiation curve, 440, 460, 480 watts per meter squared. Low eccentricity here, so the cycles are not very strong. And here's that recent peak around 9 or 10,000 years ago. And notice, though, that they're paired with the opposite pattern in winter, so that if you have more radiation insolation in summer, you have less than average in winter, high seasonality. And you see every 20,000 years, you have this interesting pairing, high seasonality, then low seasonality, high, low, fades out a bit, and then 10,000 years ago, higher seasonality again. To put numbers on this, I've taken the seasonal insolation through the year, and to make the effect look even bigger, I subtracted this high seasonality, or the low seasonality from the high seasonality. So when you have high seasonality compared to low, June and July have 60 watts per meter squared more insolation at the equator. And in December, 60 watts per meter squared less. And you see that this high insolation value goes all the way to the summer hemisphere pole, 60, 70, even 80 watts per meter squared. Now this is an extreme, of course, because I'm comparing high to low, but if you think of the average being about half of that, that means that the amplitude of the precession cycle at the equator is about 30 watts per meter squared. The annual average is around 400, so it's around 7 or 8% change in the intensity of the seasonal cycle. And that really has a profound effect on tropical convection and on the temperature of the continents. Next. So I'm showing that schematically here. This is the high seasonality, more insolation in June, July, August, northern hemisphere. So the tropical convection and the monsoons are automatically stronger. But the whole continent warms up a lot because of its low heat capacity, whereas the mixed layer ocean doesn't respond very much. So you get this change in the land-ocean temperature gradient. And with the larger temperature, higher temperature over the continents, you draw in air from the ocean, and that enhances the moist flow onto the continents. It enhances the monsoon. So in this schematic here, I'm showing wetter conditions with high seasonality in June, July, and August, a very strong heavy circulation. And if you look over at the opposite, the low seasonality, you have to think southern hemisphere being different because of the tilt, but this is southern hemisphere summer, and so the southern hemisphere monsoons are strong at that season. So that's the monsoon signal, and I pretty much forgot thinking about the opposite season for something like 30 years. And around 2010 or 11, I began asking what happens in the case of these cold winters. And it turns out that you also have a reduction in the tropical precipitation because of the reduced heating at the equator. You saw it was 30 or more watts per meter squared. In addition, the whole northern continents are colder because of the radiation signal I showed you before. So the major baroclinic zone gets shifted south. And so the winter storm track shifts, for example, in Europe from being across England and France and northern Germany to being more in the Mediterranean. So this is actually a huge change. And it's something that I haven't realized, that there was a pairing of strong monsoons that ate away, so to speak, at the southern edge of the Sahara Desert. But in the same orbital period, you had a stronger winter Mediterranean track that brought rainfall further south in the Mediterranean basin. So there are these two forcing factors that are squeezing down on the size of the Sahara and the Arabian Desert, and they work together every 20,000 years. So you have a smaller Sahara in the Arabian Desert, and it gets larger 10,000 years later, and it gets smaller. And that this began to think that this could be a factor in human migration. Now, I was just finishing the work, and a friend of many of ours, Brian Hoskins, at Imperial College at the University at Reading, had actually been thinking about the same thing and had published a paper in 2010 talking about this same winter aphelion signal that I'm talking about today. I don't know that he's followed up with that, but so this is now the excitement in my mind, and I was excited when the possibility arose to do a long climate simulation and see if I could see this changing of the summer monsoon mechanism and of the Mediterranean storm track mechanism and the effect that it would have on the deserts. So if I could have the next slide. The experiment we did, and we could do a better job now than when this was run 4 or so years ago. But here's the time scale from 140,000 years ago to the present. We're using CCSM3. We had to use a fairly low resolution version because we didn't have that much computer time. And we had to accelerate the forcing. So the 20,000 year precession cycle, every year you go a factor of 100 further into that cycle. So you complete a 20,000 year precession cycle in 200 years of computer time. And we were able to complete this whole run in 1,400 years of computer time, which at the time was pretty good. If we could rerun this experiment today, I think we could use at least T42, and maybe we could get by with an acceleration factor of 10 or 20. And I dearly wish we could do that. But people have experimented with this technique. I don't know how many of you are familiar with it. And in terms of the land surface reacts very quickly. So you get a very realistic change in the temperature and rainfall over land, and the mixed layer ocean has time to react. The only thing that doesn't react is the deep ocean. So any coupling of the deep ocean with these forcing things can't be believed in this simulation. But the rest of it turns out to be pretty reliable, and we've checked that by doing short period experiments at selected times. So now you know a bit about how the model was put together. We used the orbital forcing through this whole period. That's very well known from astronomy. A very important term is the greenhouse gas concentration. We know that from the Vostok ice core. And I'm just going to point out that from around 60 to 20,000 years ago, the CO2 concentration was below 200. Turns out that's going to have a really big effect on tropical precipitation. The final thing we had to do was to estimate the ice sheet height and location. And that isn't very well known. But we know the ice volume pretty well because the oxygen isotopes that are preserved in calcium carbonate shells on the bottom of the ocean have both O16 and O18. And when you have a lot of ice on the continent, preferentially it's the lighter oxygen that makes up those ice sheets. So the carbonate in the marine organisms on the bottom of the ocean are enriched in O18. So this signal here looks a bit like an oxygen 18 signal. We took the last part of it, for which we know the ice sheet very well, and we developed a correlation between ice volume and ice height and area that we applied both in North America and in Europe. I think it gets the big picture right. This is the previous ice age. This is the interglacial when there was no land ice on North America and Europe. Gradually we began to get ice in this period, and the really long ice age was from about 60 to 20. So I think the ice is about right too. Next. And if I had to stop the presentation here, I won't. You're going to have to watch a bit more, but this is what excited me the most, because we plotted a diagram in time from the beginning of the run to the present, latitudinal averages from 50 to 40 north. And we're averaging over in the eastern Sahara and in Arabia and the Middle East, this area where a lot of studies have suggested that humans first made their way from equatorial Africa into the Middle East. And the first panel here shows annual rainfall, but we all know that in this region here, the annual rainfall is primarily summer rains. So this is the monsoon. And in Turkey and bits of the other bits here of southern Europe, most of the rain is winter. It's a Mediterranean climate with winter rain and summer dry. So what you see here is a very large monsoon signal, which didn't surprise me. But I was delighted to see that the winter rains in the southern part of Europe and the Mediterranean basin tend to come south during the period when the monsoons extend further north. And so you almost have a meeting, not a very large amounts of rainfall, but you definitely see rain here, and then during low seasonality, a large latitudinal band with very low precipitation. More precipitation, low. And this point where they meet is around 27 north, which is in sort of southern Israel today in the Negev desert. The model, and then the next thing to notice was that during the Ice Age, when there were also a lot of evidence for dispersal of humans, the borders of the summer monsoon don't change much, and the winter rains continue. The really heavy summer rains decrease, and I'll get back to that. But there's still, and this was a surprise to me and to many people, people thinking that the glacial period is cold and arid. Well, it's definitely colder, but it isn't that much more arid in the Mediterranean basin. The model had a parameterization for grass, and so the grass shows the same tendency. Not very high percentages here. These are fractions of a grid square. So that, you know, here you get to have 20, 60% of a grid square is grass, maybe the rest was forest. But in this transition zone here, you go from having at least a little bit of vegetation to a broad zone that has almost no vegetation, no grass, a little bit more, less, intermediate, and then here, more again. And now we're in a period of a rather arid Sahara Desert. Next. The story, of course, continues into equatorial Africa. So here's a similar diagram of rainfall from 140 to present for the average for the points shown here, which include all of the big East African Rift Valley lakes. And not surprising, but it's sort of hard for us Northern Hemisphere chauvinists to wrap our heads around it. There's an out-of-phase relationship that when the Northern Hemisphere monsoons are strong, the Southern Hemisphere monsoons are weak because it's the rains are, heaviest rains are in December, January, February. That's the southern summer. And when the northern summer has weak monsoons, the southern summer has its strong monsoons. So it was nice to see this in a transit simulation. The equator is different because, as you know, parts of the equator have a double rainfall maximum when the sun is overhead. And it turns out that when perihelion occurs at the equinoxes rather than at the solstices, you get sort of a blurring of this extra rainfall into these seasons between the solstice seasons into the equinox seasons. There's a dramatic decrease in rainfall during the glacial. It's something like 30 or 40%. And I'll come back to that in a minute. And I think there's somewhat of a reversed tropical cell here because the rains pick up through this whole period at 15 south, which is the latitude of the last of the large Rift Valley lakes, Lake Malawi. And the evidence, since I'm talking about it right now, is that Malawi had 3 wet phases, and then it was wet during the Ice Age, very dry in between, even drier than the model simulates it. But it was wet and had high levels when the Lake Victoria on the equator was very low. So there's already some hint here that the model is showing some things that agree with reality. Next. So to get a better picture of what humans might have encountered, we first of all look at the vegetation changes that go along with the temperature, rainfall, insolation changes that we've been talking about. We used a model developed here at Wisconsin by John Foley and Chris Kutzbach called IBIS. It allows for 15 different kinds of plants, including 8 trees, evergreen trees, deciduous trees, and so on. several grasses, several kinds of shrubs, and the desert. So here I'm lumping them into just 4 groups. And I only have time to point out some of the more striking features. So this is the high seasonality, when the northern monsoons are strong and the Mediterranean storm track is relatively strong. And here's a good marker is Lake Chad at around 13 or 14 degrees north. Notice how the grass shrub boundary has pushed way north of there and pushed halfway up into Arabia. And there's still a bit of grass, up to 10% in this desert biome here. And so it agrees with the previous picture I showed you pretty well. But you get a sense of the large area of the northward push of vegetation. And in contrast, with low seasonality, you see that the vegetation border is south of Lake Chad. There's almost no vegetation on the Arabian Peninsula. And the areas that are grassy here tend to be more steppe-like here because it's drier. And I could go into more details, but that's the big picture next. From a climatological point of view, this is a busy slide, but on the left are January, July, August precip. Here's winter precip. At high seasonality, 125,000 years ago, the first big low seasonality case. I only have time right now to focus on the difference. So this is the difference between the two in summer. And you see this large band across just about where Lake Chad is, 15 degrees north, where the rainfall is about double, about 100% larger than the climatological average. And this is due to the strengthening of the monsoon. Brian Hoskins has written about this. Because of the strengthening of the East Asian monsoon, you have a sort of a vast west to east cell, and you have even drier conditions in the Mediterranean in summer. In the winter season, remember I was excited about the stronger rain in the Mediterranean basin when we have these cold winters. And you see it here. A ton of, it's not that much rainfall, but overall there's not that much rainfall in the Mediterranean basin. And it extends all the way from Spain in particular, all the way over past the Caspian, and down into the Negev as well. These features show up in the annual. Much more rain across this huge band. More rain in the Mediterranean basin, and the precipitation minus evaporation, an excess here, and a bit of an excess here. I think it's the warmer summers that detract from increasing P minus E at that time of the year. Next. So now let's come to the glacial. And this is something that it might have been Suki Banabi, and if it wasn't Suki Banabi, it was his Tony Broccoli, who had worked with him, who I think were the first people to notice that the lower carbon dioxide had a dramatic effect on tropical temperatures and on tropical rainfall. And I'll come to the rainfall picture in just a minute, but if you'll just believe me for a second that we're looking at a carbon dioxide signal here. The size of the glaciers doesn't have a very large effect here, but the lower carbon dioxide causes a dramatic reduction in tropical rainforests, which are mainly these green trees here. You could compare the amount of green here with the much larger green here and much larger green here. I haven't calculated, but it may be close to a 50% reduction in the area of the tropical rainforest. The northern boundary of the monsoon doesn't retreat any further than Lake Chad, and you actually still have rain and vegetation in the southern part of the Arabian Peninsula, and that agrees with some of the paleo-environmental evidence. And if you look very closely, you'll see that there is one effect of the ice sheet, and that's to sort of redirect the jet stream all the way from North America. It actually starts with the North American jet being moved south by the large North American ice sheet. So you have the jet plowing into Spain, and then more storms in the Mediterranean even during the Ice Age. And so that the vegetation here looks a lot more like it does here than here. And just to point out one or two features, the shrub vegetation, which is a drier vegetation, is there's more of it here. The amount of shrubs here and here are somewhat similar. Next. Getting back to the more conventional variables, and again, in the interest of time, just looking at the difference map, this is the difference in summer and winter precipitation, glacial compared to the model control. And you see that the glacial period has drier summers, drier winters, but here is the stronger Mediterranean storm track during the glacial. And if you look at the annual rainfall, just a very dominant signal. This represents about let's see, it's about a 30 to 40% drop in annual precipitation across from 10 north to 10 south across here. Also decrease T-E. And you see the effect of the winter storm track being stronger here with weather conditions all the way into the Middle East. And more positive T-E. Next. Well, if this were just a modeling story, you could either believe it or not believe it. But the other interesting thing that's happened in the last 15 or 20 years is the amazing increase in the number of paleo-environmental records. And I've just summarized a few of them. This is by no means all the records that we've been looking at. One of the newest and most exciting ones are speleothems. These are caves that have stalactites, and water drips down through the roof of the cave, increases the size of the stalactites, and you can analyze the oxygen 18, among other things, composition of these stalactites, and learn something about the rainfall during, and if you're lucky, you get a continuous record. So these speleothems have been looked at, and John Valley, who's sitting back here, is one of the pioneers in this area, in China, here in India, China, throughout the Middle East, proving to be extremely valuable. There are also lakes that have long cores that produce pollen diagrams that directly talk about the vegetation. There's offshore marine sediments that often contain pollen or other remnants of what kind of an environment exists on the continents. And let's see, well, there's lakes that are dated that perhaps are large during the wet periods, dry in other periods. And then finally, the sediments of the Mediterranean contain organic layers that are indicative of monsoons. They're called sapropels. So a big part of our project is not only running this simulation, but comparing the results with these kinds of data to make sure that we're getting the paleo-environmental record correct. And then we'll leave it to others to argue about whether humans really are moving more readily across the Sahara or the Arabian desert because of a more humid climate, or whether they just had the gumption to get up and go regardless of what the vegetation was like. And there's a very active battle going on in the anthropology field about the real causes of migration. But if there was an environmental component, I think our work is helping to nail that down. Next. Happy thing is that this work is continuing. Over the last 10 years, I've begun to know more people that work in tropical Africa, including one of our co-authors, and this gentleman here, Rick Potts, who's the director of the early human project at the Smithsonian. And Rick has contracted with us to continue these studies of climate simulations and of comparisons with environmental records, particularly in East Africa, back through time. One of the other pleasures we had, which is not showing up too well, but Keith and I were able to travel to Africa, to Olduvai Gorge, where some of the Leakeys made their most famous discoveries about early hominids and early Homo sapiens. And the final picture is just a summary. We've actually done something which had never been done here with a GCM. There's one other simulation of this kind that was done with a climate model of intermediate complexity. They're called EMIC, E-M-I-C. Axel Timmerman was the lead author. And he did a similar study, but it doesn't really show the actual tropical or extratropical cyclones in the Mediterranean, and its simulation in the monsoons is very poor. So I like to think that we've done the first transit simulation with a fully dynamic climate model. This is one of the key postage stamp results that I like to point to. So we're claiming that the combined response of the summer monsoon and winter storm tracks produces this shrinking or widening of the Sahara Desert and the Arabian Desert, which may have been a factor in human movement away from equatorial Africa. We're finding some surprising results about how the glacial period still had a relatively strong monsoon, even although it had a devastating effect on tropical Africa, which may in fact have been one of the things that got people moving if the tropical rainforest had changed as much as it did. And we're leaving it to others to compare in detail whether the times of maximum dispersal line up directly with these times of climatic change. Thank you for your interest. Happy to answer questions.
I have maybe two that are rather separate, John. First, can you use your simulations to look at the subtropical and polar jets around the Mediterranean during the periods of enhanced storm track? It'd be interesting to know what the jet structure looks like at the tropopause. Second one is there a phasing between technological advances among evolving humans and these periods of time where it might have been most advantageous to make a move?
Okay, the first question is, yes, we have the history tapes of the complete files of the three-dimensional atmosphere. So we could look at the changes in the vertical structure and horizontal structure of the jet streams.
Because the current structure is that the entrance region of the subtropical jet is just off the northwest coast of Africa. I don't know if that was true, 40,000 years ago or something. It might have been further north or further south.
Yeah, we could definitely look at
interesting.
that. And I'd be happy to
Let's talk about that.
help facilitate that.
Okay.
Your second question was whether there were large technological changes that might have.
Yeah,
Or-
shipbuilding, or I mean not ships, but any kind of flotation across narrow waterways or something, because it looks like the southern part of the Red Sea or the Gulf of Aden is where they may have gone across to the Arabian
Yes.
Peninsula.
Yeah, well, first of all, when you first say technology, I think of tools, and there really isn't. And I always like to tell people when I'm beginning to tread on thin ice, because I'm getting outside of my field here, but I talk with a lot of these people. But tool technology actually doesn't change very much. There are some anthropologists who think that climate variability, and including things like Danskar-Oshkar cycles and things like that tend to be during the cold periods, force people to become more adaptable, and they learn how to maybe to make it easier to cross difficult places. So that's one of the arguments. Fire, of course, was much earlier. But I didn't talk about this, but the Neanderthals and earlier Homo erectus, they had gone into Europe and Asia much earlier. This goes back quite a bit before this. We're just talking about people like us, Homo sapiens. The third thing is very interesting, and that is travel by water. And I didn't mention that, but that is the other very active idea, that they might have just gone up the rivers, like up the Nile, or they might have gone up either the west coast or the east coast of the Red Sea. Undoubtedly, they would have sort of hopscotched along. So if the land were more verdant, it probably would have been easier for them. But I think it's pretty well believed that they had the sort of rafts that would have allowed them to make those kinds of journeys, especially if they stayed within sight of the coast. I'm not going to try and bring up one of the maps again, but at the southern tip of Africa, where it comes very close to the Arabian Peninsula, that is a place that people talk about a lot. It turns out it's only, I think, about 30 miles wide, but it is deep. So even during the Ice Age, with a drop of 150 meters of sea level, it was still a deep channel. But it's certainly potentially possible that they crossed there as well. And so I think water transport, as well as adaptability or taking advantage of environmental in more friendly conditions, those are the two or three things that are being argued about at the present time.
Okay, thanks.
Yes, great.
This may be a dumb question, but would the currents in the Red Sea reverse during years when the Mediterranean might have more of a positive amount of water during the year, as opposed to when it's negative, so that there could be more flow in the Red Sea toward the Mediterranean? I don't know if it's completely open in that direction or not, but would that make a difference?
You know, I can't answer your question about the, I mean, there is an opening at the southern end of it. I think the northern end was more swampy and ephemeral. These rainy periods, when the Mediterranean storm track was more active, actually reduced the salinity of the northern half of the Red Sea. There are ocean cores that sense the sort of creatures that live in more or less saline environments. So there's a couple of papers that say that the salinity and therefore the density structure of the Red Sea did change through time. Whether that affected the overall currents or not, I don't know. That's the best I can do with your question.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just curious, if that would affect the navigation, the way people would move. If
Yes.
we were talking about some navigation that was occurring along the
Yeah,
coast.
yeah. Well, certainly the seasonal monsoon winds are also very strong along some of those coasts, so there could have been a seasonal component to travel for sure, and it could have been easier or less easy at different times.
Are there times when the Nile completely dried up, or can you tell?
To my knowledge, no. And the headwaters of the Nile are close to the equator. So actually it's tropical rainfall that feeds the real floodwaters of the Nile. And you can measure the outflow of the Nile into the Mediterranean. So I think the answer is there are periods of stronger and weaker flow depending upon the strength of the monsoon. But to my knowledge, there's always been a Nile flowing. But there's an asterisk after that. There have been, just to add, there's a really exciting work done with ground-penetrating radar, which shows that literally all of North Africa has fossil river beds. For the period when the monsoon was stronger and water was draining north in the Mediterranean in many, many places. And those fossil riverbeds are now covered with sand dunes.
The model simulations, you talked about wanting to redo these with the next generation of models. What's the ocean representation in this model? And I guess what are the major processes you're hoping, or do you think are, say, uncertainties in this? Frontal resolution, ocean processes, what's the?
Well, the choice was made to run it with a pretty much a full dynamical ocean, which in a way was a waste of computer time, because with this acceleration, you can't believe it anyway. But if you could reduce the acceleration rate, it would pay. But it's actually run with, 10, 12 level ocean and 1 to 2 degree horizontal resolution. But we're not looking at the results. I think the mixed layer is pretty good. At T31, it's surprising how much smaller the Mediterranean is, because the grid squares are 4 degrees, almost 4 degrees by 4 degrees. So we have run snapshot simulations with a T85 resolution, and we get a much stronger Mediterranean storm track. So the result we're getting here is one arm is tied behind our back, because any storms moving through the Med are not being replenished at all by Mediterranean moisture. They may be drawing up moisture from the tropics into the extratropical systems, but not but the Mediterranean isn't helping very much. The other thing that is a bit troublesome is that the high latitudes, during the period of when there's quite a bit of ice that is put in by that method that I showed you, that tends to keep the high latitudes cold through this whole accelerated run. So we have too much sea ice in the North Atlantic. And so being able to run at lower acceleration rates would, I think, would also actually make the things I'm talking about more apparent. So the things that we've noticed that are hurting us because of the acceleration and the low resolution are actually minimizing the storm track changes and maybe even the monsoon changes.
So I was wondering, especially with the resolution of, and given the importance of the wintertime storm tracks,
Yeah,
it seems like a real opportunity.
yes, and I could show you results at T85 where the lowering of pressure in the Med and we actually tried to track individual storms. They're much better simulated. But T31 is enough to have little blobs of low pressure migrate across the Mediterranean. So we're pretty sure that it's working. And actually, this is a pretty well-known mechanism that when Europe is having a cold winter, it's actually almost like a negative NAO that you have an active Mediterranean storm track. So there's good modern climatological basis for saying that the model should be doing this. Any other questions? Greg again.
You know, in some of the studies we've done in the Mediterranean, we've made some calculations. We find that very little moisture can get in from the Atlantic basin into the Mediterranean because of the high mountains that surround it. You know, it can't be, by the time you lift air over the mountains, it brings out the moisture. I'm expecting that in your simulations, the mountains must not be as high, or you do something to lower them, to keep the mountains high and maintain that effect.
Well, that's a really good question. And you know, I don't know anybody that's fooled around trying to, so basically what we do is just conform the underlying topography to T31 resolution. So the mountains are not very high compared to what they'd be at T85 or T104 or 1 degree. And so that's something that should be looked at. It also affects the height of the ice sheets that we have in the model. So I think I've confessed all my sins pretty well. So it's the height of the ice sheet, it's the sea ice, it's the land mass in the Mediterranean. T31 is the only thing I could say is this one other run that was done with a model of intermediate complexity was done at T21, which is about a 10 degree by 10 degree. So we have about 4 times the resolution of that model.
No, but it probably still misses a lot because, you know, if you're fairly narrow ridges.
I am 100% with you. I didn't know that so you're saying the Alps and the
Atlas Mountains, the Alps,
Pyrenees.
The Atlases?
Pyrenees, all the way. The only place moisture gets through is through the gap in Rock of Gibraltar around there, the Gibraltar Straits. And other than that, it's really hard to get moisture in unless it comes up from the tropics.
Yeah.
You know, over Egypt and
Yeah.
Libya. But that's the only place. Libya, the moisture can come up because it goes around the Atlas Mountains. But those Atlas Mountains are like a 18,000-foot bearing.
Yeah, they're big.
Yeah, we did some preliminary work with a model with isotopes and water tagging. And we did find that by the time these Mediterranean storms got over into the Middle East, they were, I don't remember the number, but like 30% of their moisture was coming up from tropical plumes from the Indian Ocean.
You made me curious about the operational problems of navigating the Nile. You know, how long would it take if you put a raft in the Nile for it to float to the Mediterranean Sea? And what's alive in the Nile that could be, you know, like fish that could be eaten along the way to sustain yourself if you were on such a raft? Is there any knowledge of those parameters?
If I was 21, I'd like to do that trip. I really can't answer your question. It's a good question.
There's a lot of waterfalls.
Stefan, I don't know if, I think Stefan may not have still been here. Stefan has been around. Oh, Stefan, how long would it take a raft to get from the upper reaches of the Nile to the Mediterranean?
I've not yet done that.
But there's an implied plan.
The question about the atlas of the 18,000 feet. I've been on the high parts of the atlas. It's not 18,000 feet.
What is it?
Well, first of all, it's in meters.
What is it in meters? What are the higher?
It's not. I mean, it's not 6,000 meters.
It's 4,000, I think. About 14,000 feet or so.
It's less than that.
Okay.
But anyway, it's still.
Well,
there.
thank you for your mountaineering expertise, and I wish you well on your rafting trip.
Does sound like there's a plan. Any other questions for our speaker? Well, join me again in thanking John for.
It was good to be here today.
Yeah.